Good evening. Good evening. Hate to stop good conversation, so I do want to thank everyone for coming this evening and also for being a part of our testing and our protocol that we do at the university. We have one of the best records for COVID testing and protection of our students, and we take that protocol wherever we go, because we want to make sure we care about your health and safety as well. And so, as we begin the program this evening, it's my deep pleasure to welcome Jeff Kodosky, one of our trustees from the class of 1970, to kick us off. And Jeff, welcome. And kick it.
So thank you all for joining us this evening. In case you didn't know, there are 5 Rensselaer Regional Executive Councils located in key geographical areas where there are engaged alumni and parents. Our own Texas Triangle Executive Council is actually the newest one, and it's joining others in Silicon Valley, New York City, New England, and New York State's capital region. These councils were created to strengthen connections and offer opportunities for engagement in each of these regions. The last panel that this council presented was virtual, so we're pleased to come together in person for today's conversation. I now have the pleasure and honor of introducing the Honorable Dr. Shirley Ann Jackson as the moderator of today's conversation. As a result of Dr. Jackson's strategic leadership since her arrival at Rensselaer in 1999, she's had numerous accomplishments that have transformed the Institute. During her tenure, Dr. Jackson has overseen the successful completion of a $1.4 billion campaign, and it's currently leading a new $1 billion campaign. And I'm happy to say we've exceeded the halfway mark, and the Institute's endowment for the first time has reached the $1 billion mark. Dr. Jackson has focused on transforming the student experience by envisioning the award-winning concept of CLASS, Clustered Learning Advocacy and Support for Students. We're really good at acronyms. And bringing the program to life. She's received numerous national and international awards, including the National Medal of Science, the United States' highest honor for achievement in science and engineering. Most recently, she was named the 2021 recipient of the American Association of Physics Teachers Oersted Medal and the 2021 recipient of the FBI Director's Community Leadership Award. Dr. Jackson continues to represent Rensselaer across the globe through participation in international events such as the World Economic Forum and truly elevating the global presence of the Institute. Dr. Jackson continues to successfully lead the Institute through a global pandemic, always with the safety of our students, faculty, and staff on campus as the absolute priority, resulting in one of the lowest infection rates in the nation. Please welcome the 18th President of Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, the Honorable Shirley Ann Jackson.
Thank you, Jeff. Well, good evening, and let me thank Jeff. He's been taking really good care of me today, such good care that I told him I was going to run away and let him do the moderation here. But I am very pleased to once again be in Texas. I could tell you a lot about some of my Texas adventures, including visiting the Comanche Peak nuclear power plant during my tenure as NRC chair, but I've been back a fair amount. And I don't know if you know that more than 3,700 Rensselaer alumni, and parents are here in Texas, and I want to thank so many of you for joining us this evening. So we're here today for a conversation with Institute and industry leaders and experts whom you will meet shortly on the rapidly advancing fields of data, artificial intelligence, and computation, and the opportunities that these fields offer. And I've had the pleasure of talking with some of you about some of the work you're doing in these areas. So first, to set the stage a bit, let me provide you with an overview of 4 research initiatives at Rensselaer that you will see are all interconnected and have relevance in addressing the global challenges of today and in the future. And so the initiative that today's discussion is focused on, Data, AI, and Computation, or what we call DAKE for short, will serve as a foundation and a true underpinning for the advancement of the other three initiatives while advancing foundational work in all of these areas in and of themselves. And these four initiatives will be implemented through the establishment of new centers or institutes at Rensselaer that align with existing signature research thrusts and encompass our collective expertise and critical partnerships across the Institute and around the globe. Now, the first initiative is the establishment of the Institute for Energy, the Built Environment, and Smart Systems, or EBES. As Jeff says, we are the masters of acronyms, which focuses on the challenge of urban growth and the ability to anticipate, investigate, and mitigate the effects of global climate change while providing, importantly, energy security and a focus on human health and well-being. Now, EBES focuses on the possibility of what we refer to as seamlessness, where each city is viewed as a system of systems in order to achieve a collective multi-scale intelligence to benefit all while bringing together architects, engineers, and policymakers to affect this seamlessness. And this requires focusing on deep decarbonization and climate resilience as well, through the use of advanced technological solutions to devise responsive new materials and sentient building platforms for net zero structures, as well as to model and design cities with integrated transportation, communications, and supply chain networks. Now, the second initiative is the establishment of the Center for Engineering and Precision Medicine, or the CEPM. We haven't quite worked out a good acronym for that one, which is a partnership with our affiliate, the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai. Now, a major expansion in biomedical and clinical research, the home of this center will in fact be in New York City. Specifically, for those of you who are familiar, and I was asked about this, at West 54th Street, near the Mount Sinai West Hospital, which was formerly Roosevelt Hospital, and adjacent to several of Mount Sinai's new research activities and labs. The CEPM will focus on disease mitigation and improvements to human health through precision medicine, which creates treatment specific to the patient. And specifically, the CEPM will be focused around three pillars: neuroengineering, immunoengineering, and regenerative and reparative medicine, ranging from the molecular to the cellular levels and ultimately to the whole patient level. The third new initiative is the Global Freshwater Institute, which will address the challenges of climate change, pollution, and the overuse of freshwater systems and the effects and stressors on them with cascading consequences. In fact, I often speak of the fact that I'm not one who thinks of risks as a listed set of risks, but one has to think about intersecting and interacting risks, or what I refer to as intersecting vulnerabilities with cascading consequences if there's a triggering event. Now, this institute will build on our work that we have done through the Jefferson Project, which is located on Lake George in New York, which has made, we believe, Lake George the smartest lake in the world, with LiDAR imaging in lake mesocosms, 500 sensors on 51 platforms in and around the lake, and sophisticated data analytics. And because of the early work we've done in identifying stressors, looking at harmful algal blooms, we've been asked to expand our work to other lakes in the Adirondacks, including Skaneateles Lake and Chautauqua. And so the new institute will allow us to expand that work, to understand stressors in the microbiome of harmful algal blooms, and importantly, what then the genetic signatures are and the effects that cause the blooms to become toxic. People refer to harmful algal blooms sometimes as just the presence of, the green algae or whatever comprises those blooms. But the real issue has to do with the effect on human health. And that's when these stressors cause the cyanobacteria to create cyanotoxins. And the fourth initiative, and you're going to hear more about this tonight from John Dortick as well. And the fourth initiative, and the reason that we're all here today, of course, is the establishment of the Data Artificial Intelligence and Computation Institute, which will have a research focus and a graduate division. And it will examine new computational paradigms, allowing humanity to address, ever more complex challenges. And this initiative builds upon strength that we have developed under our Rensselaer plans, or are developing in data science and data analytics, in quantum and neuromorphic computing, and in AI-enabled high-performance computing, as well as, interestingly enough, AI-driven gamification in immersive, virtual, and augmented reality environments. Now, all of this undergirded by a magnificent computational ecosystem that we have developed with the AMOS system, which has, it's in the petaflop range. No. Yes. And it also has a number of graphics processors. And this center is going to aid in the advancement of efforts in the other initiatives while advancing these subjects in and of themselves. And Jim Hendler, whom I'll introduce in a moment, is quite an expert in these. Now, as these global challenges are being addressed, the opportunities for incorporating DAKE for advanced technological solutions to a myriad challenges will be identified, and we think we'll draw out some of those tonight. And so now let me introduce our four distinguished panelists for today's discussion. I'm going to read their names and titles, but you can read more about their tremendous accomplishments in the event program. Now, Dr. Jonathan Dortick is my special advisor for strategic initiatives, but importantly, he is an institute professor in chemical and biological engineering and biomedical engineering and the biological sciences, where his research group focuses on gaining a quantitative understanding of biological principles and applying them to advance the fields of biomanufacturing, biocatalysis, and new human cell culture platforms for drug discovery. Dr. Dortick was previously our vice president for research and the director of the Center for Biotechnology and Interdisciplinary Studies, and he recently, just last year, was elected a member of the U.S. National Academy of Engineering. Now, joining us virtually today is Dr. James Hendler, Jim. Dr. Hendler has been the director of the Rensselaer Institute for Data Exploration and Applications, the Rensselaer IDEA. Now, that is another acronym. And he's also been the director of the Rensselaer IBM AI Research Collaboration, or the AIRC, as well as being the Tetherless World Professor of Computer, Web, and Cognitive Sciences. And in forming that constellation and bringing Jim and his colleagues to Rensselaer has allowed us to create the #1 IT and web science program in the country. So Jim, I hope you can hear me. I'm saying good things about you. I hope your ears are red. And then we have Mr. Eric Starkloff, who is President and Chief Executive Officer of National Instruments, headquartered right here in Austin, focusing on accelerating NI's vision to drive long-term growth and innovation. And Mr. Starkloff has been instrumental in defining and implementing the company's strategic direction for more than 2 decades. In case any of you have, not been very aware, our own Jeff Kodosky was one of the founders of National Instruments and developed the original technology that the company was based on. So Rensselaer people have great influence. And last but not least, Mr. Michael Miller of the great class of 1980 is co-chair of the Rensselaer Texas Triangle Executive Council. This is the only triangle we have because, you know, Texas is huge. Pretty soon it will probably have all the points of the Lone Star, but right now it's the Texas Triangle. And he is the Chief Executive Officer and partner at Midstream Power LLC. He has extensive experience in the management of and investment in companies focused on energy, utilities, and communications. And so I want to welcome all of our panelists and ask them to join me here so we can begin our conversation. I don't know if you have met Greg Easton. He's our Vice President for Institute Advancement, and he's been helping us really lead this campaign that you've heard about. And Greg, maybe you should introduce the other members of your team who are here.
All right, with us today is Berta. Berta just joined us recently in our events area. And Darlene is in charge of our marketing communications and really assists me with the campaign. And we have Joe up there is filming us today, and Tom is doing photography. Where's Tom? I'm right here. But we're very fortunate to have a great team, and this is the team that's pitched in through COVID, and Berta has recently joined us at the end of COVID, but this team has stuck with us for 18 months as we've worked to host shows like this or bring things forth like this. So thank you so much.
Before we discuss the future of DAKE and the opportunities the field offers, I think we have to try to understand the concept and where it stands currently in the industries that Mr. Miller and Mr. Starkloff represent, as well as the challenges and opportunities it presents. And good evening.
Yeah, good evening.
So let me pose the question this way. If you think about National Instruments, I think of it as creating systems and technology that allow people to measure anything, anywhere. And so a real question has to do with where's the company going? And then, if you will, you know, how does data and AI play into building off of this tremendously successful base to carry it into the future?
Yeah. I get to lead off. I was thinking as you were introducing everyone, I was like, I think I have the distinct honor of having the least degrees of anyone on this panel, so I hope that I can contribute something useful. As you said, President Jackson, our business is focused on connecting to the real world, measuring the real world. And what's interesting and what's happening in that space is that the complexity of the things that people are engineering. Think of a 5G chip, for example, a system of systems like you mentioned earlier, has gotten so high that the ability to sort of just determine all of the inputs and outputs of that is going beyond a human comprehension. There's about 5.5 million test cases for a chip like that. You can't manually construct those. The other thing that's happening is the things that the engineers that use our products are doing, those systems are becoming AI-driven as well. The classic example a lot of people, of course, think of is the autonomous vehicle. And one of the things that we're researching in our labs is how do you verify the operation of a device that itself is AI-driven,
exactly.
Right? Because normally the way our world works and the way it's worked for many decades is you think of a known set of inputs and you measure a set of outputs and you determine if the thing is working correctly. An AI-based system like an autonomous vehicle is probabilistic. It doesn't have a distinct set of outputs, and it's specifically designed to deal with inputs that it's never seen before. So how do you actually determine that an algorithm is working correctly? This is actually a new area for the industry. And
so how do you do it?
Yeah, well, here's how you do it. You actually have to test it with AI algorithms. Really the only way to do it is to use a system similar to the system that you're testing to actually create the inputs and measure the outputs of that. And so that's a really pioneering new area. And it's particularly important because the autonomous car that everyone thinks about, the challenge we're facing is actually a challenge of validation. We know how to do sensor fusion to construct the world around that vehicle. We know how to do paths through your navigation system already does that quite well. What we don't know is how to determine if we validated enough possible use cases that vehicle's safe.
Well, here's an interesting question, and maybe it's one that maybe I'm going to ask Jim Hindler ultimately to follow up on as well. And that is, what do AI-driven systems do in terms of how we think about uncertainty quantification? Jim, did you hear me?
Yes, ma'am. So, it really is, so uncertainty quantification, for those who are asking, is, how do we know when we get an answer from a computation or from a model just how accurate it is? And for these AI systems, we're still very much able to test them in a context, so it makes it very hard for us to hear them beyond the context. So I hope you can hear me, and I hope this is coming through okay.
So I'm going to throw out something, and I think John may have a comment about this, but in a different way. So the real issue is a way to test an AI-driven system that has some degree of autonomy, to test it through a gamified set of scenarios where choices have to be made, complexity is built in, and one can see how well the AI-driven system can navigate those scenarios. And when those scenarios themselves may be AI-driven, and it gets more and more complex, but
They almost certainly have to be AI-driven. I think on any system of reasonable complexity, it's unlikely that you're going to come up with all of the scenarios manually.
right. So, Mr. Miller, Michael.
Yes.
So you've done a lot of work across a broad frame relative to energy, but in particular looking at critical infrastructure, including, of course, the famous grid. And can you talk for a moment about some of the challenges relative to the grid management, particularly in light of changing weather patterns or any scenario that would challenge the resilience of the grid?
Right. So if you think about the way the electric grid worked, call it 20 years ago, you had a set and finite number of power plants that were fossil or nuclear, and literally you could say, I need 5 more megawatts, you press a key, you get 5 more megawatts. Well, what's happened is the grid is undergoing a fundamental change in a couple of different ways. Number one, the penetration of renewable, solar, wind, is growing dramatically. And the problem there is those plants are not dispatchable. You don't dial it in to say, I need 5 more megawatts. You're taking whatever comes from it. And now you have to integrate meteorology, i.e. what's going on with the wind, what's going on with cloud cover, relative to your generation sources. So you've introduced a lot more variability into the production of power. In addition, in a lot of states, you now have people putting solar panels on their roofs. So what happens is at 12 or 1 o'clock in the afternoon, you're getting probably more power out of those rooftops than that home is actually using. So you need to manage, well, now all of a sudden I'm getting generation in my neighborhood. So you're adding another area of complexity, and that requires understanding not only what's going on the transmission system, you now have to get down to the distribution system. So you've created a lot more nodes that you have to pay attention to. And it used to be you could have an operator or operators in a control room, almost like an air traffic controller, say, okay, I need a little more power here, this is what's going on there. Well, now the level of complexity is increased, and the number of variables you have to think about has increased. You also have energy storage that has to be integrated into all of this, and it has to be managed and dispatched. So, this is not going to change. As a matter of fact, it's going to get more this way because you're going to see more and more renewable. That renewable is both going to be big projects, but it's also going to be little projects distributed all around the grid. So you now need automated systems at a minimum to gather in and process all this data, because a human being can't do it quickly enough on a real-time basis.
But doesn't that also bring up the whole issue of distributed intelligence, because the idea of you have all this this data, you have these systems, but is it really realistic down the line that everything's going to be controlled from some central control, as opposed to having some intelligence in the network?
Well, that's a great question. I think that's an area that's evolving. So let me talk about an example where you can, in effect, automate all this and use an AI. So American Express fraud alert, they're using AIs. And the nice thing about, and why it's workable is, number one, you're getting a lot of data, so you have a lot of information that you can analyze. Number two, if you get a false positive, the cost of that false positive is low. So I get a text, I just charged something, but the AI says, wow, something weird has happened. So what's the worst that happens? Okay, it's a pain in the butt, I gotta respond so I don't get my charge reversed, but I appreciate it because if somebody gets a hold of my number who shouldn't have it, you're patient with it. And the cost of a false negative, i.e. you don't pick it up, is really big. So sort of the risk reward is balanced the right way. Well, the issue you have with distributing that intelligence around, and why you still want human beings in the loop, is, the cost of a false positive can be a lot bigger if you start moving power around when if you're getting a false positive, hey, I'm overloading here, so you want to cut a circuit. Well, cutting a circuit to 500 homes, that's not a low cost kind of situation. And if you're doing it a lot, it becomes a real problem. So, right now I think it's great. It can gather data, it can process data, but you still need human intelligence in the loop. Over time, I think that'll change as they get more experience with this. You can start automating more of it.
Well, actually, what I was wondering about is, does it give you, the use of AI, the opportunity in the face of all this data to be better at detecting anomalies, which can then tell you if there's some instability that is occurring?
Yeah, well, that could be especially helpful when you think about, look at what goes on in Texas. So during the middle of the summer, a lot of your wind generation is coming from north and west Texas. Well, you're riding kind of on the edge during the summer anyway, because that's when loads are highest. And if up in Amarillo, Texas, the wind speed drops from 20 miles an hour down to 5 miles an hour, you're going to lose a lot of generation quickly.
Right.
So being able, number one, to predict that this could happen because you've got enough real-time meteorological information coming in real time is critical. And then number two, if it does happen, where else are you going to go to get the power? Or do you have to start, literally, you're going to get that tight, you got to cut people off, because the problem with a grid is you get too unstable and you don't react quickly enough and you bring it down. I mean, that's catastrophic.
Yeah, it is, but don't large baseload plants have a role in stabilizing the grid?
They do, but there's less and less of them all the time. All your nuclear plants are at risk. Your coal plants are getting shut down. So what's happening in this state is your large baseload plant pool is shrinking relative to the total population, so you don't have as much cushion in the system as you used to.
No, I don't disagree with that. I'm just thinking that from the point of view of a grid operator, as well as the companies themselves that are generators, there's a whole set of questions about how you plan and look at issues like the stability of the grid, particularly if you have a case like Texas, where that grid is not necessarily so strongly interconnected to the rest of the country.
Yeah.
Right. Okay, well, let me pick on John Dortick for a minute.
Not the first time.
So John, tell us a little bit more about how you see the opportunity that DAKE offers, given what we've been doing in biotechnology and the life sciences, and particularly with the advent of the Center for Engineering and Precision Medicine. And so how do you think that nexus of AI and high-performance computing can help us address unmet problems in human health.
Yeah, so, I'm struck by what we've talked about so far really deals with complexity and systems of systems. System of systems. And so it becomes a multidimensional problem and something that is inherently difficult to model. It's difficult to control. And perhaps the most complex of all system of systems is what we get from biology. If you think about our ability to understand even the simplest biological function, which would be what a cell does, we know a little bit here and there. People won Nobel Prizes for lots of that little bit here and there.
That's true.
But we still don't know how to build a cell. And therefore, if we don't know how to build it, we're not actually able to model it particularly well. We can't really use it as well as we would like, although we're certainly taking advantage of things we now know to make a lot of biological products and so forth. And it's really transformed the chemical industry and it's transforming human health. So I kind of look at this and say, well, if I were to say what has happened in the last few years that has made a significant impact and it's just going to become even more significant over the next decade, it's being able to understand the most basic holy grail of biology, which is how do you go from the gene sequence to the protein, structure and function. And why is that important? Because most drugs do something, inhibit or block or activate something to do with a protein. And that's how it helps you overcome a given disease. That's how it helps you, have a better life and so forth. So therapies and therapeutics all depend on our ability to somehow interact with a biological system that we don't even know how the proteins are really made. But in the last year or so, efforts at Google, as well as at University of Washington, and then probably thousands of other places around the world have come up with a way to use AI algorithms to actually do a pretty good job of predicting what a structure of a protein would look like just simply given its gene sequence. And we know the gene sequences. That technology is available now for very cheap. We use it for determining whether or not we have a COVID on campus, right? So that technology exists. But now we have the opportunity to understand, well, how does this basic function in biological systems, in cells, in our bodies, how does that actually work? And I think it's probably up at about 95% accurate for fairly simple proteins, not the kind necessarily that are going to be critical in terms of a therapeutic, but the technology is getting there. What do you need? You need the algorithms, and of course you need the high performance computing, because the number of possibilities of how a protein will fold into whatever its structure is remarkably large. It's more basically than the number of molecules are in the universe. So it can't just by chance do it. So this is where computation comes in with AI that will drive that basic understanding. Now, where do we go from there? So what we're trying to do in our Center for Engineering and Precision Medicine that you mentioned that we're building up in New York City is to start looking at how can we use computational biology, computational bioengineering. So now it's not just the biology, but now extending it to the engineering, to be able to now understand how do complex systems of cells come together. Let's say if we want to form new tissue, how do we coax the cells to do it? Right now, most of it is somewhat trial and error, but we can look at computational biology as ways to control that trial and error, to make it better, more efficient, and more personalized to every one of us, because all our bodies are the same. How do you make a drug that would be effective, for example, in treating a neurodegenerative disease? How do you make a drug that's ideal for a given person? Remember, 1/3 of the drugs that are made are very effective against for an individual. 1/3 actually are somewhat toxic, probably doesn't hurt you too much, but it can. And 1/3 don't do anything. So that's a challenge that we face. So how do we use the capabilities of AI, the capabilities of high performance computing, so we have tremendous computation, so that we can model things better at the basic molecular level. And so that's what we're going to be looking at. You had mentioned from the molecular to the cellular, ultimately going to the organismal and into the patient themselves. So that's one way that we would bring all this together.
Well, thank you. So Jim, Dr. Hendler, so let me digress for a moment. Jim is a fellow of everything, but he is the co-inventor with Sir Tim Berners-Lee of the semantic web. And along the way, you could kind of articulate the semantic web, what it is and why it's important. But Jim also was chief scientist in the Information Services Office of DARPA. So he's had quite an experience across a broad range. And so in particular, Jim, you've had extensive experience in the individual fields of data, artificial intelligence, and computational and research in all of these. Can you talk a bit about the evolution of these fields and how they are literally coming together and what some of the challenges are that have to be overcome for us to realize the dream of a DAIC?
Sure, thank you, Dr. Jackson, and thank you for letting me participate virtually. I apologize to everybody that I wasn't able to be there today. I think the easiest way to answer that question is I go back in time, not that far, maybe even just only 10 years. And if we look at what would be taught in a database course or about data, it was primarily how to structure it and how to rapidly access it. Sort of think of it as spreadsheeting, but with a lot more technology under it. If we looked at AI, learning systems just didn't have enough computational power for us to believe they were really going to be breakthrough. So we used what are called semantic or knowledge-based activities. And in fact, where the semantic web came into that was linking data together on the web so we could try to collect it. But still, having collected it, we were still mostly using it as your database. And then if you looked at the supercomputing world, it was almost completely focused on modeling and simulation. So how do we model what's going on inside that nuclear plant or something else with a lot of equations and things like that to try to really get a understanding rather than trying to sort of learn it based on what we observe. And then really what made the huge difference is Curtis Cream of the great class of 1982 developed something called a GX graphics chip, which evolved into what's now called a graphics processing unit created by NVIDIA. And the combination of that device, the sort of supercomputing we have, and some of the algorithms that were being developed for AI, just was a perfect storm of bringing together the technologies we needed. So now you can use the web and these traditional methods to bring a lot of data somewhere. You can then use these AI learning methods on that data in a reasonable amount of time, and once the GPU is involved, that time goes way down. That time can be hours. That time for some of the computations that John was talking about with biology can be months. So, I mean, they're still very complicated. And then we're really looking at how to put that all together. The other obvious wild card in the deck, let's call it, is that quantum computing is coming along now. And that can help us model certain kinds of phenomena and do certain kinds of computation very quickly. We just don't know yet how to put these all together. So what we see in DAIC is really the need to develop a program which brings together all of these different things, the computational work, the distributed work, the AI learning, et cetera, and really takes us to a new level of these capabilities so we can do the kind of things that were being discussed earlier on this panel.
You know, in the end, and this is really a question for Eric and Michael. You know, a lot of it always comes back to data and what we do with it. But the whole issue of how you bring data sets together and how they're organized seems to be more and more critical. So can each of you talk a little bit about how your industries are focused on bringing data sets together in a way that adds value? And
Yeah, I can start. So
Yeah.
yeah, because our whole industry sits at the intersection of the sort of digital and analog worlds, right? We're sensing the real world, bringing it into digital formats. And that's got its own set of interesting attributes. One is it's a huge amount of data. It's effectively infinite. It's only driven by how much fidelity and how many channels. And generally speaking, people are more trending in the direction of more and more sensor points and higher fidelity. The issue of, well, let me make one comment and come back to your direct question. The paradigm in our industry, which I think is probably paralleled in a lot of different places, is really shifting to be more data centric. And when I say that, just think about, you know, most engineers in the room, right? So people have used an oscilloscope or a multimeter. You know what that sort of process is like. That whole thing is set up around the limits of computational power and the limits of data storage and the limits of data transfer. The whole idea of taking a rich waveform and turning it into a single measurement so that a mere human can view that as a voltage or a rise time, that's the whole measurement world has been built up around that concept. Well, today, we don't have to do that. We have huge amounts of processing power. We can stream terabytes of data very easily, cheaply. So why reduce all of this rich data into some single point? We don't need to do that. So now it's reversed. It's don't try to reduce it down. Take large amounts of analog data. Let algorithms figure out what's the good data within that. It's a little bit like the analogy I use is, can you imagine if some of the social media companies that are collecting so much digital data, if they're not thinking about what's the good data and what's the useful data and what's the less useful data. They're taking all of it and let the algorithms sort out what's the useful data and what's the predictive data. That's happening in our industry. Now, the challenge to your question directly is, of course, like any AI system, I suspect, getting the data in a format that the algorithms can be effective is actually a big part of the role. In our world, that means getting data and formats that can traverse across design, simulation, and the real world. That's an area where, you know, we're certainly doing work with design companies to be able to do that. But I think that's really important so that we can ultimately, you know, go directly from a simulated world into a real world and back, and have the algorithms work correctly on data across those different domains.
In fact, in a minute, I'm going to ask Jim Hendler to comment on that, but let me hear from Michael here.
Okay, so going back to grid management.
Yes.
You know, we've gone from a top-down, it comes from here, it distributes out. Well, this has got to become two-way, because in order to manage and control the grid, you have to have sensors and information coming in literally from almost every single home to understand what is power use on a real-time basis so that you can very accurately model what's going on with the transmission system, because power flows where it flows. You can't switch it or control it. But so you need to be able to model it exactly to make sure you're not getting overloads anywhere. So you've got, you know, for instance, more and more utilities are installing smart meters so that, you know, every second I know exactly, you know, this home on this block is using this much power, this home is doing that. This home has a solar panel, it's pushing power back out the other way. So getting the sensors so you're getting the information and then being able to aggregate and collate all that information is going to become critical as the grid becomes literally more and more distributed and more dependent on variable generation sources to keep it all in balance and keep it working.
So let me ask you another question, since we're sitting here in Texas. What role does AI have or potentially have relative to oil and gas discovery and production?
Okay. So right now, I actually had a conversation with a friend about this. So right now, where AI can be helpful is you can get more data and analyze it so that if there are subtle things that a human eye can't pick up looking through a spreadsheet, you can get better and better information out of what's going on in a field, and you can model it more accurately. But you still need the geophysicist or the geologist to understand and interpret the data. We're not to the point where an AI can take 3D seismic information and say, boom, drill here.
Why not?
Yeah.
Do you think we'll get there? Because that seems like a job they'd be great at.
That's a good question.
That's a great
Is it
question.
a matter of time, or is it, yeah?
From what I understand, the technology is not there yet. And once again, if it gets it wrong, the cost of when you're putting $10 million down a hole, if the AI doesn't get it right, it's a problem.
Well, but I'm going to push back on you a little bit, Michael, because if you look at global EMP, this is different than, say, putting the $10 million down a fracking hole.
Yeah.
This is when you're looking at discovering really large oil and gas formations, and you and I have both been involved on the upstream side. And so people spend more than $10 million.
I was just talking per well out in West Texas. You're talking about $1 billion in the Gulf of Mexico.
Right. And so,
yes.
and so people make bets on what geologists tell them, and they miss.
Yeah.
And so, what do you say?
It's a fair point.
Hey, if
I was the geologist, I could tell you. Okay.
I wonder how much human psychology is at work there too. It's a little bit like with the autonomous car. We know, and people have studied this, how much safer does it have to be for us to trust it? Maybe 100 times safer? Not twice as safe. It's actually not that hard to get twice. Human drivers are terrible.
They are.
Right? They're terrible. And so, but psychologically, we want it to be 100 times safer before we're comfortable giving up that control, even though intellectually we know we're all terrible drivers and we kill each other on the road all the time. Right?
So what are the challenges you see in aerospace and defense? You talked about autonomous vehicles. What do you think are some of the challenges and opportunities in this arena that relates to both AI but also quantum computing?
Yeah, there's probably people with more quantum computing expertise on the panel that can chime in. From my perspective, that's certainly a big accelerant that can take some of these algorithms to the next level in terms of computing power. But yeah, I think in aero defense, we always talk about the autonomous car because consumers are quite familiar with that, and it's in the popular press. The use of autonomous systems is actually quite a bit greater in aerospace and defense application today. And they're very much leading edge, I think, in those applications. So we see that as a space that's really at the leading edge of autonomous systems and the development of those autonomous systems.
You think it's going to play a role? I mean, we had this Webb telescope that was just sent to the L2 Lagrange point. I've always thought that that's where physics really shines, Jeff, right? And, good. And so I think there is an issue, really what some people are referring to as cognitive navigation, where there will be some intelligence that helps to, as we go further and further into space, that everything can't necessarily always be pre-programmed.
Yeah.
And so, but anyway, let me ask Jim Hendler. So talk to us, Jim, about data governance and the role it can play, and any comments you want to make on quantum computing in any of these arenas.
Sure. So let me back up a second and say, we've been talking about data, and it's my fault because I mentioned spreadsheets early on, but I just want to make clear the AI systems, we're also talking about language data. So, a lot of the problems John Dortick works on, you have to be able to literally read journal papers or understand from the journal papers how to extract from that something that the machine can then manipulate as data, things like that. So it's a much more complicated thing. And what we're looking at now is how do we put together all these different kinds of things? So the sorts of problems that have just been defined require taking data from these different places, bringing them together, and of course, then whose data, who owns it, who owns the product of that data. So data governance is becoming more and more important now. We used to have a fairly sharp distinction between the person who owned the physical part of the world and the person who owned the digital part of the world. So now we see more and more what are called cyber-physical systems. Smart grid was mentioned before, things like that, where these things come together. And again, now the problem is on one side, maybe you have analog things happening, on the other you have digital things happening. And you can't just put something in there and just say, let's sample at a certain rate, or things like that in many of these very complex problems. So again, we're really grappling with, as well as all of these issues of technically how we put this together. I think one of the key words that was said today, in fact, it's one of our top priorities in thinking about data, is it was trust, and you might even call it truth and trust. So how do we know when we're getting data from different things, essentially what to believe, what not to believe? And I don't necessarily mean in the sense of misinformation, disinformation, which are their own big problems, but also, again, is the sensor working right? If I'm using a distributed learning system, what's going on? One of our researchers at Rensselaer, Carlos Valera, actually looked at some of the problems that the Boeing system was having that was on the 737s, and actually showed that what the problem was one sensor not knowing what another sensor was doing, and that when you integrated some of that, you could actually solve some of these problems. But they were built by different people for different reasons. They weren't considered part of the same aerodynamic system. So in a sense, what we're really looking at is how will we take a much larger, more systematic view of things? John talked about the human as a system. We can look at the airplane, the autonomous vehicle, and then figure out, where does the AI belong? Where does the human belong? How much trust do we get in there? And what kind of data do we need to bring in? And what kind of data can we really trust given the rules of whatever game we're playing? So again, in air traffic, we have to have very high quality, trustworthy data, and something showing up as an anomaly that will cause us to do a lot of work to get around it. So really, as we look at these systems, we're talking about things like distributed learning, things like that. And then, of course, we're looking at, as a university, one of the biggest problems of all, which is where will you get the people you need to hire to help you solve these problems? And that's really, to a large degree, where DAKE is all about, is getting students who can really understand across all these pieces, who can help us figure out the answer to the question of where quantum fits in. And, really will be able to take us to the next level of understanding this work.
I think we probably, on average, need more discussion about where quantum computing would be important, where neuromorphic computing would be important, and where your traditional von Neumann-based systems come into play, and how do they play off of each other? How do they integrate across if needed? And what does that mean in terms of algorithm development? Do you agree with that, Jim?
Oh, absolutely, Dr. Jackson. I was, knowing you're a physicist, I was looking for an analogy, and I would say that right now, computation is very much in the place where Newtonian physics was in the early 1900s, perhaps, where we already knew that it wasn't going to be the correct thing, but we didn't have something better around, and lots of different things were being proposed, lots of things were happening, and eventually we had to start creating new fundamental science about how these things work. building the engineering systems that let us test that science, and then we could build those huge applications, those nuclear plants or nuclear bombs that really went, so all the way up from the foundation to the engineering to these world-class problems need to integrate all of this. And we really are looking now at how do we bring those things together at a mathematical level, at an engineering level, and of course to solve big problems. Talking about where quantum comes into this is really interesting because we know there are certain problems it's very good at, but right now quantum computation doesn't talk to
That's right.
kind of thing. So the GPU lets my traditional computer and my AI learning algorithm talk together better. Obviously, I'm
Right.
putting scare quotes around the word talk. We still don't know exactly how we're going to talk to these quantum machines. We know they can do it. So, for example, John was talking about modeling certain kinds of proteins. We know these things will do a better job of it, but then how do we read out what it tells us so that we can integrate that in a way? How do we communicate it? We have new devices, quantum communication, that give us these unbreakable ways of letting certain things talk to each other. But we can't integrate those into the network we have today of routers and things like that make the web work. So really, we're sitting at the edge of what I think will be to the information age what the 1900s were to physics. Really, the complete rethinking, renovation, whole new things. I would love to be the guy who comes up with the string theory of computing. That probably takes a couple generations from now, with them some.
Well, Jeff and I will talk to you about that later. But since you brought up string theory. But let me, I'm going to ask two more questions, one to Dr. Dortick and one to everybody. So John, I had talked about the Global Freshwater Institute, where we're going to try to look at stressors, including going to looking at the microbiome, going to the genomic level. How do you see DAKE playing a role in terms of what you're trying to do there? And by the way, I have to give one more ad for John. It's John's, we have a heparin applied research lab at the tech park because John works with another professor who bioengineered the first synthetic heparin. And that lab is where we do our PCR testing. And it's because of, John's, it's really John's lab where we do it. But talk about, fresh water.
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Jackson. Actually, let me put a plug in on you. So talk about Global Freshwater Institute. That really built out of what you had mentioned, the Jefferson Project, which is at Lake George. And that transformed what we had up at the lake, which was an ecological, limnological research center, Darren Freshwater Institute up at Bolton Landing. So then Dr. Jackson and John Kelly, a trustee, spent many years at IBM, brainstormed and decided, well, we need to do something more significant up at Lake George as a test bed to understand how do we keep a lake like Lake George beautiful? How do we not have it turn into some of the other lakes and other bodies of water around New York, quite frankly around the country and around the world, that have become went way down the road to becoming much less safe. The water is obviously contaminated, certainly not very pleasant to go into and to recreate. And Lake George has kept its pristine state, but it's under some stress and it's under a threat. So they came up with the Jefferson Project at Lake George, and now that's morphing into the much bigger thing called the Global Freshwater Institute. And so when you look at a lake, it looks kind of simple, but really you have to consider so many different things. The water, of course, what's in the water, the chemicals, the biology, what organisms are in there, You have weather that influences a lot of things. You have runoff, and you have people that live around it doing things that are good or not so good around the lake. And you have physics of the lake, which is the water movement underneath. And there are waves, actually, in Lake George. You go from one end to the other, and a lot of larger lakes have this. Not unlike what you have in a bathtub, if you move in a bathtub. All of those things play a role in ultimately impacting how organisms like cyanobacteria will grow, what other organisms are around them, how that ultimately leads to a harmful algal bloom. But I want to go backwards, actually many years. About 20 years ago, I had a project funded by DARPA, and it had to do with being able to use metabolic engineering, which in this case is simply being able to control various pathways in a cell, but to come up with something that would give fluorescent products. Nobody could see, it could be seen by something that could detect fluorescence. And the idea was that you could use this to put into plants, let's say in Central Park, that pathways would turn on when a chemical threat hit. And so satellites would look down and say as an early warning. Okay. So why am I bringing that up? Because take a look today, if you look at where AI can play a significant role, it's in image analysis. And we know in radiologic images that happens a lot. People now are using AI algorithms to detect cancer, for example, in radiologic images, and to do that as well as the best radiologists, although I guess some of them may not agree, but anyway. But they don't get tired, right? Right. They do it all the time, continuously. Well, now take a look at something even broader. What about understanding the images that you get of the lake, of the environment around the lake? And you can be precise. You can determine what are the chemicals, what's the biology. You can look at it at resolutions that are extraordinarily high. And so you have tremendous information that comes, but you have to be able to detect what's happening there. Not only static images, but over time, so they'll be temporal. And that allows you now to start looking at AI algorithms with huge amounts of data that you'll need computational capabilities that can actually give us early warning on what's happening in a lake in terms of whether or not an algal bloom will form, whether it will be toxic, because not all of them are, they don't look good, whether they'll be very rapidly forming and disappearing, what's the impact of the people who use the lake on that, and being able to parse out that information to give us ideas of what can we do to keep a lake pristine, what can we do to treat a lake that has gone fairly toxic, and that, is a use of a satellite system with extraordinarily high precision, and using an AI algorithm to be able to tell you that.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. You said something about pathways opening up or maybe closing up if there's a threat, such as some kind of a toxic threat or perhaps biological. One that I've always thought we need to think a little more about is, and I've talked about how you bring data together, is reconfigurable data architectures, but ones that reconfigure based on the detection of anomalies or some threat. And I'm not hearing a lot about people doing these things, but maybe it's all happening under some kind of, classified system. But it's an important issue because I actually think patches are not going to be the solution. Down the line, the horse has left the barn by the time one is implementing patches. So you have to be able to think more, particularly as these data sets explode and explode and explode. So, here's the latest jazzy thing, the metaverse, right? So you have, Microsoft, Meta, you know, and Alphabet, you know, making big investments in AI and the like. Okay, so, okay, Eric and Michael, is the metaverse of any relevance to what you do?
Boy, let's see. I'll do a personal take, and then I do have a professional take. I mean, I do have a concern. I mean, based on the interest of the companies that are driving it. You know, it's kind of the next version of our social media platforms in a way, right? And there's a rule of thumb of social media platforms that they all trend towards a shopping mall, right? That's right. We have all seen that. Eventually, they start in one way and they end up a shopping mall. And the reason for that has nothing to do with the technology. It has to do with the commercial interests of the companies that are driving those platforms. And the early read on that term metaverse seems to be in that direction. So that's a concern. Now, on the other hand, just like those other platforms, the actual underlying technology we've leveraged to tremendous value. And I think the underlying technologies of immersive experiences, of augmented reality, I mean, already today, those have tremendous value in real applications. And as we've been talking all today about AI and these intelligent systems, the interface between people and intelligent systems is a very, very important area. And those technologies, I think, are pushing the leading edge of that area, which is important. And things like digital twins, which we didn't talk about, but that's an area that's similarly, you know, bridging the simulation and physical world. And again, those underlying technologies, I think, enable us to do some really incredible things. I hope that we can drive the technology more in that way and less, you know, I also maybe am influenced by, I have 2 teenage daughters, and the last thing I want is a more immersive social experience. So, but
Michael?
maybe I'm alone in that opinion.
All right, well, the way I think about it is, think about how many data centers and how much power the data centers use just to do cloud computing.
Yeah.
Now you're taking the processing power required to create a truly immersive meta virtual world. That data processing power is going to be even, I'm not enough of an expert to know, an order of magnitude higher. So now all of a sudden, you're going to be putting more and more computing power that consumes more and more physical power. So where is that physical power going to come from? Well, building new
Nuclear power plants.
Well, I wish you were right. But it takes a long time to build them, right? And, you know, building gas-fired generation, which can be brought on quickly, is very, very difficult because, you know, the permitting is tough. Getting new pipelines built, getting a transmission line built takes years and years. So this all sounds great, but you got to power this stuff. And then on top of that, you're electrifying the transportation fleet over time. So you're doubling down on the amount of electric power you need in an environment where it is more and more difficult to permit the infrastructure that you need to power all of this stuff. So I don't have the, you know, I have my own.
So you're a skeptic here.
No, I'm not a skeptic. It's going to happen. I believe it's going to happen. It's just going to be very interesting in terms of how we, you know, you have to come up with, you know, meta is great and virtual world is great, but at the end of the day, you have physical electrons that have to be generated and moved and managed.
I totally agree with you. Remember, I was the chairman of the NRC.
Yes.
However, I will say this, that people are, in fact, working, and I think this is going to happen with the CHIPS Act. People are working at how you design computational systems and architectures that are less energy intensive.
Yeah.
Because people recognize that you can't just, you know, go on and on and on and on with these systems. So I think there will be a kind of, it's not just going to be software driven. It's going to have this major hardware and hardware architecture component. Otherwise, we're not going to get anywhere. And so I'm agreeing with you, but I actually think people are really thinking about that as we go forward. But having said that, I'm going to give one advertisement for Meta, and it's called Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. And And we created something called the CISL a few years ago, the Cognitive and Immersive Systems Laboratory. And so what is that about? It's about combining cognitive agents, AI-driven agents, avatars, you can call it whatever you want, in augmented and virtual realities at human scale in impact. I'm giving an ad there too. As both a learning tool, a business decision-making tool, and as its own research platform. And so and you talked about digital twins. Well, in the pandemic, we used digital twins when we were remote. That's like how we do stuff, right? And so that had a nice impact for our students. But we really have these unique platforms with impact, with people like Jim, with the work with the Amos system, and we are already bringing that together, and have in this Cognitive and Immersive Systems Laboratory, because maybe we should have gotten there first and called it Meta, because they're stealing the idea from us, and we are using it as a learning tool. And some of you may have heard and your eyes glazed over when we talked about the Mandarin Project. And the Mandarin Project was about combining gamification, AI, immersion, but AI having students at human scale interacting with AI-driven, that's what we call cognitive, with AI-driven digital agents or avatars, you could call them that, in a game-based scenario that had increasing levels of complexity that students had to work their way through. And that's how they would both experience being in the scene, whether it's a piazza in Italy or a Chinese tea house or Tiananmen Square or wherever. And they have to learn the language because the avatars are speaking in the language they're trying to learn. And so that's the vision here.
Cool.
And we've actually made some very interesting progress in the Mandarin Project. But we've also used it in engineering. One of our faculty developed what we call GeoExplorer, looking at things like levees and how they behave in certain stress conditions, but to put the students there, but not in a hurricane. And they have to work through. So remember that Meta and the metaverse is really the CISL, the Cognitive and Immersive Systems Laboratory at Impact. So with that, I'm going to turn to the audience for a few questions, and I'm going to let our wonderful host here and leader to pose the first question, if you wish. And then we'll have any of you, please.
So, at the risk of derailing the conversation,
Sounds good.
maybe I'd love to hear your opinion on, will we be able to create machines that are more intelligent than we are? Every specific task we've given AI, games, video games, strategy games, whatever, it's quickly exceeded our capabilities. Will we create machines that are more intelligent than we are?
Who wants to?
Mr. Smith in the Terminator, is that where you're going? Agent Smith, rather, I'm sorry.
Yeah, maybe Jim can answer that. Jim?
I was going to say, I noticed everyone looking at me on that one.
Oh, there you go.
In fact, most of you down there probably don't get the Albany Times Union, but last week there was
My
actually
favorite paper.
a full-page article of myself and another professor, Summer Bringsgord, discussing sort of AI, morals, religion, intelligence, all of these things. I would say that we are a long way from anything that we would call more intelligent than us, in that if we include that sort of being good at a lot of things rather than just at one thing. we already have had superhuman computers for many, many years when it came to, computing the payroll or, routing some messages around the internet. But, now we're seeing them do this in things that we've thought of as intelligence, but they don't, I often use the example, if I told you somebody was a brilliant doctor and asked you, do you think they could learn to tie their shoes, right? You would either think it was a crazy question, or you would tell me, okay, is there something about this particular doctor, right? Maybe they don't, have a foot amputated or something. My AI system, I can train it to be that brilliant doctor, but then when I ask it to tie its shoes, it's got no clue. And so until we can learn to put these things together, until we can learn how these systems can build their own what are called internal representations, we're a long way from where they will move from where they are now, where I use the term dog intelligence, right? They can do, if you think you can train your dog to do something, you can train your AI to do it. But when you really go from dogs to up and up and up and to eventually to humans, you cross a very large threshold and we're nowhere near there. Yeah, lots of people are pushing on it. Lots of people think we'll get there sooner than I do. But we will see a world where humans and AIs interacting will become a major, major part of it. We use the term social machines sometimes, the Cognitive Immersive Systems Lab, the metaverse, all of these things are really about how we bring this together so that what we're good at as humans, right, and what the systems are good at as computers, let us together outperform either one alone.
Right. Let's try to get a couple more questions, please.
So from your perspective, what could go wrong? Either from a technical, like you talked a little bit about the load on the grid, but also from an ethical perspective, from where AI is today or maybe in the next couple of years, not worried too much in the Terminator land.
I'll build on both of those, because the corollary to your question, Jeff, is will we know when a system, an intelligent system, is smarter than us, and how will we know? I actually think Jim's point about the dog actually made me more concerned, because I'm like, on order of magnitude scales, what are we, maybe 1 order of magnitude smarter than dogs? I mean, we're not 5 orders of magnitude smarter than dogs. So, and computing systems go up by orders of magnitude, so I don't know how far that is, but I actually think that I'm more on the side that the more I think about that, I think there are challenges with how far these systems go, and they might go faster than we expect them to. That's been the history so far. I think
the real challenge has to do with reasoning and ethics. And I don't know that we know how to build real reasoning systems that operate in an ethical way, even though Selmer Bringsjord is working on that kind of thing, at least on the reasoning side. So it's an interesting but important question. So that's it, is if you have these systems faced with what we would call an ethical choice, what choice will it make? So,
and those aren't completely theoretical. I think many people know this, but we're facing that with autonomous vehicles today already. You've probably heard of that as an example, but they will have to make ethical choices potentially.
Yes.
And so that seems like a very specific thing, but it's like that is an ethical choice that will be programmed in and is being programmed into vehicles kind of in the current time frame.
So do I hit the pedestrian or do I hit the other car?
That's the ethical
if I'm in
choice.
an unavoidable situation?
That's right. They have to make that decision.
There could be a human in the car too.
Yeah.
Yep.
So
that's the kind of ethical choice.
But the thing.
Now, humans aren't great at making those ethical choices either in the spur of the moment.
Can I make one point?
Sure.
All of these systems, as wonderful they are designed by human beings.
Yes.
So what biases get built into
That's
the
what John
system?
just was talking about. Absolutely.
And I was just going to say that we have, in defining the Ph.D. program in DAG, one of the core courses will actually be on exactly these ethical and trust kind of issues. So yes, we are very, very aware that that's critical.
Right. Please.
So Ray Wolf here. We're doing some experimentation with AI with behavioral health. And of course you end up with like social determinants of health. But going back is, how do you approach and how are you thinking about the undetectable biases that humans who are putting together the algorithms are unintentionally incorporating? And then with the computing power, I mean, it could have massive impact before we even detect it. So this is a practical question that we grapple with.
John, you want to make any comments? Or
I mean, it's an important problem. In a way, it kind of gets back to the last question that was raised as well, because if you think about, I'm probably not going to answer the question, but if you think about how much high performance computing, how much compute power do we need to essentially cover what a human being would do, can think of, and even faster. How much energy would be required to do that? Probably can't get there today, but quantum might get you there, and that's where it gets scary, because then you might have both, our brain does things very quickly, uses a tiny amount of energy. Quantum might be able to do something similar, but with enormously greater compute capability. And so now we're starting to get at the question of, would that drive us to a machine that actually can do what we do? We just won't know. It won't do it the same way. We don't know enough about the brain to know exactly how the brain does it. But you can mimic it in some respect. I don't think we're at the dog level yet.
well, what I would say is that as long as the AI systems, and they fundamentally are machine learning systems, that they learn based on what's given to them, then you always have that problem of bias. The issue becomes, are there systems that can be designed such that they evolve based on experience, but experience that's uncontrolled experience. If you think about your children, you have a huge effect on your children, but then at some point, starting in kindergarten, if not before, they go out and they get all kinds of experiences, stimuli, etc., that you don't control. Mm-hmm. And that has an effect on the kind of person they evolve to be. And so in a way, each one of us who's a parent is taking a chance, you could argue, when we send our children out and to the world, but we think it's important that they do so, that they socialize, that they interact with other children. And so that's not where we are when we talk about designing these systems, right? Because we're not exactly designing our children, we're influencing them, right? And so I just think we're a ways away. I think there was another question here, please. And then I haven't heard anybody over here yet.
Not a data scientist, deal with real world data a lot in both oil and gas, power, but also healthcare. One of the biggest challenges that I've experienced in application of thinking about applications of AI, because a lot of people have come to me and said, can you use this system or this system, is something that I think you touched on, Dr. Jackson, which is you have what I would describe as dirty data. And it's a lot easier to train an AI system on clean data. Is there a way, and I really don't know the answer to this, but we're very interested to hear this panel's opinion, to train an AI system to effectively do pattern recognition or other computer tasks using dirty data?
Well, the man who can answer that question is on the screen.
Trust them.
Yeah, I've read an article about that. In fact, in the Big Data magazine, a colleague and I had why more data may help us clean data in ways that haven't been thought of yet. And it's basically because the more sources of data we have that relate to the same thing, the more we can correlate and look and put things together. So it's definitely a very live issue. I'll give you a very simple example. We started doing some stuff for the White House on open government data, what's now available in what's called data.gov. my group was building some demos that actually got, RPI's name on the White House website. And one of the things we looked at was several different sets of information about forest fires, how they were funded, what had happened, things like that, all coming out of the Department of the Interior. And these were used in making government decisions, things like that. When we plotted all 4 of these data sets together, we realized that in a particular year, none of the data sets reported any fires. Now in any given year, there may be no funding for this or no fire in this place or things like that, but for them all to have that, something's wrong. So we went to the chief information officer of the Department of the Interior and showed him this, and he got quite concerned and went and looked and discovered that they had done an update of their computers in that particular year, and somehow no one had noticed that it had just repeated the data from some previous times, and therefore the correlations didn't make any sense, and you were getting these zeros where they shouldn't be. Now that was one we can view by eye. When you start looking at these in a million different dimensions and a million different ways, we need these AI systems to be able to really tell us, are there anomalies in our data? Are there things going on? My colleague Kristen Bennett has done
So Jim, because we're going to have to close this out. So the question I think is, can
I've research issue, we've got a long way to go.
Okay, all right. I mean, because the real issue is there something having to do with training systems using dirty data such that they can discern things from what you'd call dirty data? And I think that is still a research question, is what you're saying.
Exactly, yes.
Okay. Any question over here, please?
Yeah, so as you add more digital data points and as you connect more things to the network, you're now at the risk of being targeted by bad actors, whereas you see more and more malicious attacks. And how do you balance the risk of the benefits of getting all this data online and getting more people access to it so they can solve problems, alongside people who have bad intentions and seem to be pretty skilled on their own?
You work with the grid, you got a take on that? That's a big one, right?
Well, grid security becomes absolutely critical, because if someone gets access and can start shutting down, flipping switches and shutting down substations, you can have, that's as you said, Dr. Jackson, the cascading catastrophic effect can occur. And, and I'm not an expert in data security, but that is a huge data security issue that has enormous impacts.
Well, I'll just make 2 comments about that. One is, well, 3. One is detection. The second is response, and the third is stability. So what do I mean by that? So we've been spending this evening talking about heavily AI. And a question becomes, do we need to give more focus, and I'm obviously revealing a point of view here, to the ability to have more subtle detection capability, and what role can AI help us with in that regard? The second is, how do you combine response and stability? So, years ago, I worked for Bell Labs, and I was for a short time on the board of AT&T before it moved to Texas. And that we spent a lot of time talking about software-defined networks. But those were important because it allowed, one was looking at things with network congestion, how you compress things, and the use of queuing theory and other things like that. Why am I bringing that up? I talked about the reconfigurable data architecture. I actually do believe that's a big deal. And how can you get both reconfigurable networks based on the ability to detect certain things, as well as reconfigure the actual data architecture as it relates to what is most critical, and so on and so on. And therefore, because your question is so important, I don't understand why more people aren't working like dogs on this, right?
Could be the biggest significance, right, where you're saying we could do all these things, but the risk is so great we just can't take a chance. Right?
Well, I think we can't. And that's why I think these things have to become, because it's a national security issue. And so this is, I'm not the computer scientist that Jim Hendler is, but I've done a lot of work with the government in the national security and intelligence frame. And I sing this song every day of the week. So, but look, I think we're going to have to draw it to a close. This has been a fascinating discussion, and I want to thank our wonderful panelists here and have you join me in thanking.